cold room. They say every hospital has its ghost stories, whispered among the night shift workers during lulls in their shifts. I used to laugh them off, thinking they were just tales to keep things interesting in an otherwise monotonous job. But now, every time I hear the word morgue, my stomach churns. My name is Ethan, and I worked as an orderly on the night shift at St. Mary's Hospital. I had the misfortune of being assigned morgue duties, something most of my coworkers avoided like the plague. It wasn't because of superstition, but the morgue had an undeniable heaviness to it. A place that stored the recently departed is bound to carry an unsettling air. I didn't believe in ghosts, not until that night. It was just after 2 a.m., and I was sitting in the break room nursing my third cup of coffee when the call came in. "Ethan, we need you to move a body from the morgue to pathology. Room 413. I groaned but grabbed the clipboard from the desk. It wasn't unusual to do transfers during the night, but I preferred when they happened closer to my shift's end. The hospital halls were eerily quiet as I made my way to the basement. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, casting unsettling shadows that stretched and twisted as I walked. The morgue was even colder than usual. The automatic doors hissed open, revealing rows of stainless steel drawers that reflected the harsh, sterile light. My footsteps echoed, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. The tag on the drawer read Unknown Male 48. Another John Doe. The body was scheduled for a post-mortem in the morning, likely a result of a fatal car accident judging by the brief note attached to the clipboard. I pulled the drawer open, revealing a body bag zipped up to the top. I quickly loaded it onto the gurney, my breath visible in the icy air. "Easy job," I muttered to myself, wheeling the gurney out. As the doors slid shut behind me, I thought I heard something, a faint tapping, like fingernails on metal. I paused, listening. Nothing, just my imagination. The elevator ride to the 4th floor was slow and uneventful, the faint hum of the machinery the only sound. I kept my eyes forward, trying to avoid the body bag's reflection in the elevator's polished interior. The doors opened with a soft chime, and I stepped into the dimly lit corridor. Pathology was at the far end, and the usual hum of activity was strangely absent. When I reached room 413, the door was slightly ajar. "Dr. Patel?" I called out, expecting the pathologist to be waiting. No answer. I pushed the gurney into the room, the wheels squeaking against the tile floor. The room was empty, save for an examination table and a few cabinets along the wall. A faint smell of antiseptic lingered in the air. I parked the gurney next to the table and reached for the zipper of the body bag. It was standard protocol to confirm the identity before leaving the body. The zipper slid down smoothly, revealing the pale, lifeless face of the man inside. His eyes were closed, his features slack. And then they opened. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a tray of instruments. The man's eyes were wide and unblinking, staring directly at me. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't happening." His lips twitched, and a raspy breath escaped his mouth. "Help me." The voice was faint, barely audible, but it was there. I backed toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't possible. He was dead. The gurney creaked as the man's arm twitched, his fingers curling and uncurling. I bolted for the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. The lights flickered, plunging the room into brief intervals of darkness. "Let me out," I shouted, pounding on the door. A low groan filled the air, and I turned to see the body sitting upright, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "You let me die," it rasped, its voice distorted and guttural. I stammered, shaking my head. "I didn't even know you." It slid off the gurney, its bare feet hitting the floor with a sickening wet slap. The lights flickered violently, and in the brief flashes, I saw the room transform. The walls were streaked with blood, and shadowy figures loomed in the corners, their faces obscured. The body stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. "You let me die," it repeated louder this time. I grabbed a metal tray and swung it at the figure, the impact barely slowing it down. "Stay away," I screamed, grabbing a scalpel from the counter. The figure lunged, and I slashed wildly, the blade cutting into its gray, lifeless flesh. It howled, a sound so inhuman it made my ears ring. The room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the shadows in the corners shifting and growing. The figure stumbled back, clutching its chest. The lights flickered again, and when they steadied, the room was empty. The gurney was gone. The body bag was gone. I didn't wait to understand what had happened. I yanked the door open. It was no longer locked, and ran. When I reached the nurse's station, I tried to explain what I'd seen, but my words came out jumbled and incoherent. No one transferred a body to pathology tonight, the nurse said, her brows furrowed. And room 413? That wing's been closed for years. I quit the next morning. I don't know what I saw that night, but sometimes, in the stillness of my apartment, I hear it, the faint tapping of fingernails on metal. The silent ward. They say hospitals are full of life, new beginnings, recoveries, hope, but at night, when the lights dim and the chatter fades, they feel more like places where life comes to die. The silence becomes oppressive, broken only by the occasional beep of a heart monitor or the shuffle of nurses on their rounds. My name is Alex, and I used to work as a night shift orderly at St. Vincent's Hospital. The morgue was part of my duties. I thought I'd seen everything in my first 6 months there. I was wrong. It started on a Tuesday. Tuesdays were always slow, and that night was no different. I just finished delivering a tray of supplies to the ICU when the call came over the radio. Alex, we've got a transfer. Morgue to pathology, room 302. I grabbed my clipboard and headed to the basement. The morgue had never bothered me much. It was just another part of the hospital, but something felt different that night. The air was colder than usual when I stepped inside. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting long, uneven shadows across the tiled floor. The smell of disinfectant mixed with something sour hung in the air, making my stomach turn. The body was already prepped, lying on a gurney in the center of the room. The tag on the toe read, Jane Doe, female, approximate age 40. Unclaimed, I muttered to myself, signing the transfer log. I avoided looking at her face as I wheeled the gurney toward the elevator. The ride to the 3rd floor was slow, the elevator groaning with age. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The polished steel walls reflected the body on the gurney, her pale hand just visible under the edge of the sheet. I forced myself to look away. It was just a body, nothing more. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and I pushed the gurney into the hallway. Pathology was down a long corridor, the lights buzzing faintly overhead. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping sound. I froze, my hands gripping the gurney's handle. The hallway was empty. The tapping came again, faint but deliberate. It sounded like fingers drumming on metal. I glanced at the gurney. The sheet hadn't moved. The tapping stopped. Get it together, Alex, I muttered, pushing the gurney faster. I reached room 302 and opened the door. The room was dark, the overhead lights off. I fumbled for the switch, but nothing happened. The air inside was stifling, heavy with the scent of chemicals and something else. Something metallic. Blood? I pushed the gurney inside and parked it next to the examination table. My fingers found the zipper on the body bag, and I pulled it down, revealing her face. Her eyes were open. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. No, I whispered, shaking my head. They're supposed to be closed. Her glassy eyes stared at the ceiling, unseeing, but they seemed wrong, as if they were trying to focus. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut on its own. Hello, I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. Then the lights flickered on, bathing the room in a harsh, sterile glow. I spun around, heart racing. The gurney was empty. The body bag lay open, its contents gone. My mind raced. I searched the room, pulling open cabinets and looking under the examination table, but she wasn't there. The tapping sound started again, louder this time. It was coming from the corner of the room, where a metal storage cabinet stood. I stepped closer, my legs shaking with every step. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The tapping stopped. The cabinet door creaked open. Nothing was inside, just empty shelves and darkness. I turned back to the gurney, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when I saw her. She was standing in the corner of the room, her head tilted unnaturally to one side. Her hospital gown hung loosely from her emaciated frame, and her eyes, they were locked on me. "Help me," she rasped, her voice low and guttural. I backed away, hitting the edge of the examination table. "You're not real," I stammered, shaking my head. "You're dead." She took a step forward, her movements jerky and unnatural, as if she were a puppet controlled by invisible strings. "Help me," she repeated, her voice louder now, more insistent. I grabbed the nearest object, a scalpel, and held it out in front of me. "Stay back," I shouted. She didn't stop. The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness for a split second before they stabilized. Each flicker brought her closer, her face twisted into a grotesque grin. "Help me," she screamed, her voice echoing off the walls. I ran to the door, pounding on it with both fists. "Let me out," I screamed, tears streaming down my face. The lights went out completely. In the pitch black, I could hear her breathing, ragged and wet, as if her lungs were full of fluid. Then I felt it, cold fingers brushing against my neck. I turned and swung blindly with the scalpel, the blade connecting with something solid. She let out a guttural scream, and the lights flickered back on. She was gone. The door creaked open, and I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. I didn't stop running until I reached the security desk on the first floor. "What happened to you?" the guard asked, his eyes wide as he took in my disheveled appearance. "There's something in room 302, I managed to say between gasps. He frowned. "Room 302? That wing's been closed for years. I quit the next morning. I don't know what I saw that night, but sometimes, when I close my eyes, I hear it, the soft tapping of fingers on metal." The last delivery. Working the night shift at Mercy General wasn't my first choice. But bills don't pay themselves, and I figured a quiet hospital job would be easier than bartending or working retail. I was wrong. My official title was logistics support, which was just a fancy way of saying I move things from point A to point B: supplies, documents, the occasional patient transfer. But sometimes my job involved the morgue. I never liked going down there. Something about the air felt wrong. It wasn't just the chill from the refrigeration units. It was the silence. The kind that seemed to press against your ears and make your own breathing sound too loud. The night started like any other. A few patient transfers, some paperwork for the ER, and a lot of coffee to keep me awake. Around 2 a.m., my radio crackled to life. "Logistics, we've got a pickup. Morgue to pathology. Room 312. I hesitated. Transfers from the morgue weren't unusual, but they didn't happen often, especially not at night. "On it," I said, trying to sound casual. Grabbing the transfer paperwork, I made my way to the basement. The morgue was colder than usual that night. The air smelled faintly of bleach, with a metallic undertone that I couldn't place. The fluorescent lights flickered as I stepped inside. The body was already prepped, lying on a gurney in the center of the room. The tag on the toe read, "Doe John." "No ID again," I muttered to myself, signing the paperwork. The body bag was zipped up tight, its contours revealing the outline of a human form beneath. Something about it made my skin crawl, but I chalked it up to exhaustion. I wheeled the gurney out, the sound of the squeaking wheels echoing through the empty halls. The elevator ride to the third floor was uneventful. I tried not to look at the bag, but it felt like it was watching me. I laughed at myself. Bodies don't watch people, idiot. The doors opened with a soft ding, and I pushed the gurney into the dimly lit corridor. Room 312 was at the far end, near the pathology lab. The hallway was eerily quiet. No nurses, no doctors, not even the hum of machines. Just the faint buzzing of the overhead lights. When I reached the room, I stopped short. The door was slightly ajar. That wasn't unusual. but what caught my attention was the faint smear of something dark on the handle. "Probably just grease," I muttered, though my voice didn't sound convincing even to me. I pushed the door open. The room was empty, the gurney waiting in the center. A chill ran down my spine as I realized there was no one here to receive the transfer. "Hello," I called out. My voice echoed in the stillness. No response. I rolled the gurney into the room, parking it next to the other one. I reached for the clipboard on the table to sign off the transfer, but when I turned back, the body bag was unzipped. I froze. The bag had been sealed when I left the morgue. I was sure of it. The zipper was pulled halfway down, revealing a pale, motionless hand. "Okay. Very funny," I said, my voice trembling. I expected someone to jump out and yell "Gotcha!" but no one did. The hand didn't move. It just lay there, limp and lifeless. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. The air in the room felt heavier, like it was pressing against my chest. I reached for the zipper, intending to seal the bag and leave as quickly as possible. But before I could touch it, the hand twitched. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over the gurney behind me. "No, no, no," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't happening." The hand moved again, fingers curling and uncurling like it was waking up. Then the arm shifted, pulling itself out of the bag. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. The body sat up. Its head turned slowly, unnaturally, until its lifeless eyes met mine. The skin was pale and mottled. The lips parted in a grotesque grin. "Help me," it croaked, its voice low and gravelly, as though it hadn't spoken in years. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. I just stood there, paralyzed with fear. The corpse slid off the gurney, its bare feet hitting the cold tile floor with a wet slap. "Help me," it repeated, shuffling toward me. I bolted for the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. I pounded on the wood, screaming for help. "Someone, please, open the door." Behind me, I heard the sound of bare feet dragging across the floor. "Don't leave me," the voice said, closer now. I turned to see it just inches away, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The grin widened, revealing teeth stained dark red. I grabbed the nearest object, a metal tray, and swung it as hard as I could. It hit the corpse's shoulder with a sickening crack, but it didn't even flinch. Its cold, bony hands grabbed my arms, its grip impossibly strong. "Stay with me," it whispered, its breath foul and freezing. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw the room differently. The walls were streaked with blood, the gurneys overturned, and shadowy figures stood in the corners, watching. I screamed and thrashed, breaking free from its grip. I grabbed a scalpel from the tray and slashed at its arm, the blade sinking into the gray, lifeless flesh. It howled, a guttural sound that made my ears ring, and stumbled back. The lights flickered again, and when they stabilized, the room was empty. The gurney was gone. The corpse was gone. I didn't wait to find out what had happened. I yanked the door open. It was no longer locked, and ran. When I reached the nurse's station, I tried to explain what I'd seen, but no one believed me. The morgue log showed no record of a John Doe being transferred that night. But I know what I saw. I quit the next day. Every now and then, I think back to that night. I can still hear its voice, whispering in the dark, "Stay with me." The night shift. Hospitals are eerie at night. The hum of fluorescent lights, the rhythmic beeping of distant monitors, and the occasional shuffle of nurses on their rounds create a soundscape that amplifies silence. But the morgue? That's a whole other beast. I just started my new job as an overnight assistant at St. Mercer's Hospital. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well, and I had student loans breathing down my neck. My duties were simple: handle the paperwork, answer calls, and assist when necessary. The morgue was supposed to be just another part of the job. Started on my third shift. I'd been warned about the creepy vibe down there, but I figured it was just the typical hazing of the new guy. The morgue was cold, sterile, and quiet, a far cry from the bustling upstairs. That night, we received a John Doe, car accident victim, no ID, no family. The paramedics had found him mangled on a stretch of rural highway. He'd been dead on arrival. The body was wheeled in around 11 p.m., zipped up in a black bag. It wasn't my first time seeing a corpse, but something about this one made my stomach churn. The attending nurse, Clara, must have noticed my expression. "You get used to it," she said, her tone flat. "Just another night." She left me alone with the body. The morgue was located in the hospital's basement, a series of narrow, dimly lit hallways leading to a single, windowless room. The walls were lined with stainless steel storage units, each with its own numbered tag. I logged the new arrival into the system, tagging him as unknown male, approximately 35 years old. When I unzipped the bag to perform a routine check, I regretted it immediately. His face was unrecognizable, a grotesque mix of torn flesh and shattered bone. His chest looked caved in, his limbs twisted at unnatural angles. But it wasn't the injuries that unsettled me. It was his eyes. They were wide open, staring straight ahead, as if frozen in the moment of impact. I pushed the gurney into one of the storage units and slammed the door shut, eager to put some distance between myself and those lifeless eyes. The metallic clang echoed through the room, followed by silence. I went back to the desk to finish my paperwork, the rhythmic tapping of the keyboard filling the void. That's when I heard it. A soft thud, like something heavy shifting. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keys. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. Thud. It was coming from the storage units. My heart pounded as I turned toward the wall of steel drawers. They were all sealed shut, the tags dangling innocently from their handles. Thud. It was coming from John Doe's unit. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to call someone, anyone, and get out of that room. But curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and walked over to the storage unit. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle. Just the refrigeration system acting up, I whispered to myself. But when I pulled the drawer open, my blood ran cold. The body bag was unzipped. I staggered back, the flashlight shaking in my grip. The bag was empty. Panic set in as I scanned the room, half expecting to see the mangled corpse standing behind me. But the room was empty, save for the hum of the cooling units. I should have left right then and there. But instead, I stepped closer, leaning into the drawer to make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. That's when I felt it. A cold, wet hand gripping my wrist. I screamed, pulling away so hard that I fell backward, the flashlight clattering to the floor. The drawer slammed shut on its own, the sound echoing through the morgue. The room plunged into darkness as the flashlight spun on the floor, its beams slicing through the shadows. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. Silence. Then, from the far corner of the room, I heard the faintest sound. Breathing. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight. The beam swept across the room, revealing nothing but cold steel and sterile walls. The breathing grew louder, ragged and wet, as if something was struggling to suck air into ruined lungs. And then I saw it. John Doe was standing in the corner, his twisted body silhouetted against the faint glow of the emergency exit sign. His head jerked unnaturally, his broken neck causing his face to loll to one side. His arms hung at odd angles, but his fingers twitched as if reaching for something. "Me. Help me," he croaked, his voice wet and guttural. I backed away, my legs trembling. "You're dead," I stammered. "You're not supposed to be here." He took a step forward, his movements jerky and unnatural. "Help me," he repeated, his voice growing louder. I turned and ran, slamming into the door at the far end of the room. It wouldn't budge. My hands fumbled with the lock, but it was stuck, the metal refusing to turn. Behind me, I heard the sound of wet footsteps slapping against the tile. I whipped around, the flashlight illuminating John Doe's face, or what was left of it. His eyes were still wide open, but now they were filled with something else. Hatred. "Help me," he roared, his voice reverberating through the room. The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into strobing chaos. Each flash revealed him closer, his broken body lurching toward me. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but no one came. Then, just as his hand reached for my throat, the lights went out completely. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor, the door wide open. The morgue was silent, the hum of the refrigeration units the only sound. John Doe's body was back in the drawer, zipped up and tagged, as if nothing had happened. I quit that night, leaving without finishing my shift. I don't know what I saw in that morgue, but I know one thing for sure. Sometimes the dead don't stay dead, and sometimes they want company.